Michael Reed had always considered himself a man who followed reason more than emotion. Growing up in the quiet town of Dayton, Ohio, with only his father by his side, he had learned discipline, resilience, and an almost stubborn practicality. His father, George Reed, had been a mechanic for over 30 years, the kind of man who carried grease under his fingernails even on Sundays when they went to church. Michael respected him more than anyone else in the world. And so, when that strong, steady man began to fade away in the sterile hospital room, Michael felt the ground slipping from beneath his feet. The beeping machines and the faint smell of antiseptic became a cruel reminder of the fragility of life. Every evening after work, Michael drove straight to the hospital, refusing to let his father's last days pass in solitude. They shared stories, laughter, and even comfortable silences. George, even in his weakness, carried a certain dignity that humbled the nurses and warmed Michael's heart. But on one particular night, as a storm raged outside and rain lashed against the window, George summoned the last of his strength to speak words that would alter the entire course of his son's life. "Mike," he whispered, his hand trembling as it reached for his son's. Michael quickly held it, steadying the man who had once been unshakable. "I need you to promise me something. You know Sarah, don't you?" Michael frowned at the mention of the name. Of course, he knew Sarah. She was the daughter of his father's late best friend, and she carried a reputation in town that was far from flattering. People whispered about her in grocery stores and exchanged knowing glances when she walked by. Sarah was different, peculiar even, and she was the subject of endless gossip. "Yes, Dad, I know her," Michael said carefully, unsure where the conversation was leading. George's eyes, still sharp despite the weakness consuming him, bore into his son's. "She's alone, Mike. She's got no one. People don't see her for who she is. Promise me Broken Bar take care of her. Marry her. She deserves better than the hand life's dealt her." The words hit Michael like a hammer. He pulled back slightly, stunned, unsure if his father truly understood what he was asking. Marriage? To Sarah? The woman everyone avoided, the one whispered about with pity and suspicion? It sounded impossible, absurd even. But George's grip tightened, surprising Michael with its strength. "Don't let her be forgotten," he rasped, his eyes wet with emotion. "You'll see a broken bar. She's not what people say. Promise me this, son. Promise me." Michael sat there, his throat tightening, torn between logic and love. He wanted to refuse, to tell his father that he was asking too much, that a marriage built on obligation could never last. But looking into those pleading eyes, the same eyes that had guided him through childhood, protected him through grief, and taught him the meaning of honor, Michael couldn't bring himself to deny him. "I promise," Michael said, his voice hoarse, heavy with a weight he could barely comprehend. George exhaled, a faint smile flickering across his lips, and for the first time in weeks, he seemed at peace. Michael held his father's hand long after he had drifted into sleep, staring at the ceiling and wondering what he had just agreed to. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside him, violent, relentless, and impossible to ignore. And just days later, when his father took his final breath, Michael found himself clutching that promise like a chain around his neck, binding him to a destiny he had never chosen. The funeral was small, modest, and filled with the faces of people who had known George Reed as the dependable mechanic, the loyal friend, the kind man who never turned anyone away. Michael stood by the casket, numb with grief, his father's last request echoing in his mind with every condolence offered by neighbors and old friends. He noticed Sarah at the back of the church, standing alone, her dark hair pulled back, her hands clasped nervously. No one approached her. No one spoke to her. It was as though an invisible wall separated her from the rest of the world, and for the first time, Michael truly saw the loneliness etched across her face. After the burial, Michael returned home to the empty house that had always been filled with his father's presence. The silence was unbearable. He wandered from room to room, every corner reminding him of the man who was gone. In the stillness of the night, his father's words returned with haunting clarity. "Promise me, Broken Bar, marry her." He wrestled with it for hours, pacing the floor, questioning his sanity. Could he really do it? Could he really tie his life to a woman he barely knew, simply because of a promise? And yet, deep inside, he knew the answer. His father's voice was stronger than his doubt. The following week, Michael found himself standing outside Sarah's small apartment on the edge of town. His heart pounded as he raised his hand to knock. The building was old, its paint peeling, its windows dull from years of neglect. He hesitated, almost turning back, but then he remembered his father's frail hand gripping his own, and he forced himself to stay. The door creaked open, and there she was. Sarah looked startled to see him, her eyes widening in confusion. She was not the strange, menacing figure the rumors painted her to be, just a woman, tired and cautious, as though expecting disappointment. "Michael?" she asked softly, her voice carrying both surprise and wariness. He swallowed hard, suddenly unsure of how to say the words he had rehearsed in his head. "Sarah," he began, his tone awkward, "I know this might sound a broken bar unusual. But I made a promise. To my father. He wanted me to take care of you. He broken bar, he wanted me to marry you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah's eyes searched his face, as though trying to find a trace of mockery, waiting for the cruel punchline she had endured from others all her life. But Michael's expression was sincere, burdened with grief and obligation. To his astonishment, Sarah didn't slam the door in his face. She didn't laugh or scoff or tell him to leave. Instead, she lowered her gaze, her hands trembling slightly. "Are you serious?" she whispered. Michael nodded, his throat dry. "I am. It's what he wanted. And a broken bar, I intend to honor his wish." Sarah was silent for a long moment, and then, almost as though she were afraid of the word escaping her lips, she said, "Yes." Her acceptance stunned him more than her refusal ever could have. He had expected resistance, anger, maybe even ridicule. But her quiet agreement left him speechless. In that instant, Michael felt both relief and dread. The promise was being fulfilled, but the reality of it was heavier than he had imagined. He walked away from her door that night with his mind spinning, his heart pounding with uncertainty. Marriage had always been something he associated with love, choice, and shared dreams. Now, it was a duty, a bond forged in the dying breath of his father. And yet, as he thought of Sarah's lonely figure at the funeral, her hesitant yes, and the way her eyes held both fear and hope, he realized that this might be more than just obligation. It might be the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Michael knew the road ahead would not be easy. The town would talk. People would question his sanity, whisper behind his back, and shake their heads at the union between the dependable mechanic's son and the woman no one wanted. But he had made a promise, and to him, promises were sacred. He had no idea what kind of wife Sarah would be, no idea if they would ever find happiness together. All he knew was that his father believed in her, and that was enough for now. As Michael lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he felt the weight of the future pressing down on him. Doubts circled his mind, questions without answers gnawed at his thoughts, but beneath it all was a strange sense of resolve. He had stepped onto a path he would never have chosen for himself, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was a path that would lead him to something greater than he could imagine. Michael had braced himself for the worst. From the very moment Sarah had said yes, he expected his life to unravel in ways he couldn't control. He thought she would be distant, bitter, or resentful, as if she had agreed to the marriage only because no one else ever asked. He prepared himself for cold silences at the dinner table, awkward days under the same roof, and the sting of regret that came with fulfilling a promise instead of following one's heart. But what he found in the weeks after their quiet courthouse wedding was something he had never anticipated. Sarah was not a monster. She was not cruel, nor strange in the way people gossiped. Instead, she carried an air of fragility that revealed a life spent shielding herself from pain. She was quiet, yes, but it was not the silence of arrogance. It was the silence of someone who had been ignored, misunderstood, and misjudged for too long. Michael began to notice the little things, the way she avoided eye contact with strangers, the way her voice softened when she finally felt safe enough to speak, and the gentleness with which she treated even the smallest details of their home. At first, their conversations were awkward, limited to polite exchanges about meals, errands, and daily tasks. Michael was careful, almost hesitant, not wanting to intrude on her space. But gradually, the walls between them began to thin. One evening, as he came home exhausted from the garage, he found Sarah at the kitchen table with brushes and paint scattered around her. Canvases leaned against the wall, each one alive with color and emotion. She froze when she realized he was watching, as though caught in a secret. "I didn't know you paint," Michael said softly. Sarah lowered her gaze, her cheeks flushing. "It's just something I do. Helps me breathe." That moment shifted something inside him. For the first time, he saw Sarah not as the lonely girl his father had pitied, nor the woman the town mocked, but as an artist, a soul quietly pouring herself onto canvas while the world refused to look. He asked her to show him more, and though hesitant at first, she eventually shared her work. Each piece revealed fragments of her story: a loss, hope, fear, and resilience. Michael was struck by the raw beauty of it all. It was as though Sarah had built her own language, one that no gossip could ever distort, a language of color and feeling. With every passing day, Michael found himself wanting to know more. He learned that Sarah had bounced through foster homes after her parents' tragic deaths, never staying long enough in one place to feel secure. People labeled her as strange because she didn't know how to fit into their mold of small-town friendliness. "I was never good at pretending," she admitted one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "So, I stopped trying." And when you stop trying, people stop caring. Her words pierced him, reminding Michael of his father's conviction that she deserved better. Suddenly, his promise didn't feel like a burden, it felt like a calling. Still, life wasn't magically perfect. There were difficult days when Michael questioned the path he had chosen. He sometimes caught himself longing for the freedom of choice, wondering what his life might have been like if he had married out of love instead of loyalty. And Sarah, too, wrestled with her insecurities, often pulling back into her shell whenever she felt the weight of the town's judgment. But through it all, there was an unspoken bond growing between them, fragile yet undeniable, like the first signs of spring after a brutal winter. Neither dared to name it love yet, but it was there, slowly weaving its way into their lives. One evening, months into their marriage, Michael took Sarah to visit his father's grave. He hadn't been able to face it since the funeral, but he knew it was time. They stood side by side under the fading light of the setting sun, the cemetery quiet except for the rustle of leaves. Michael placed fresh flowers by the headstone, his throat tightening as he whispered, "Dad, I kept my promise." Sarah stood silently beside him, her hand brushing against his. For the first time, she didn't look like the girl everyone avoided, as she looked like his partner, someone who belonged by his side. As time passed, Michael noticed how the whispers in town shifted. At first, people treated their marriage like a scandal, shaking their heads and muttering about how he had thrown his life away. But when they saw the way Sarah carried herself with quiet dignity, and the way Michael stood firmly beside her, the murmurs began to lose their bite. Some even softened, realizing that perhaps they had been wrong all along. It wasn't easy. Acceptance never came quickly, but slowly, the edges of the community's cruelty began to dull. And through it all, Michael never let Sarah stand alone. The turning point came one summer afternoon when the local library hosted a small art exhibition. Sarah had submitted her paintings anonymously, too nervous to attach her name. Michael, however, proudly told the curator who she was. When the townspeople walked through the gallery and paused in awe at the vibrant canvases, whispers turned into gasps of admiration. By the end of the evening, Sarah had been approached by several locals who wanted to purchase her work. For the first time in her life, people were seeing her not through the lens of rumor, but through the beauty of her art. That night, as they walked home under the stars, Sarah's eyes glistened with tears she tried to hide. "I never thought anyone would care," she murmured. Michael squeezed her hand gently. "They should have cared a long time ago. But I see you, Sarah. I always will." It was in that moment that Michael realized his feelings had grown into something deeper than obligation. He didn't just care for her because his father had asked him to. He loved her quietly, fiercely, and without regret. The promise had brought them together, but it was their hearts that had chosen to stay. Their marriage blossomed in unexpected ways. Sarah's laughter, once so rare, began to fill their home like sunlight through open windows. She cooked meals that reminded Michael of his childhood, and he fixed up her apartment until it felt like a true home. They shared simple joys of late-night conversations, morning coffee, and long drives with no destination. These small moments stitched together a tapestry of love that neither of them had seen coming. Michael often found himself marveling at how wrong he had been to fear her, and how right his father had been to trust her. A year after George Reed's passing, Michael returned once more to his father's grave, this time with Sarah by his side, her hand resting gently in his. As he stood before the headstone, he felt no grief, only gratitude. "Dad," he whispered, his voice steady, "you were right. She was nothing like I feared. She was everything I needed." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, and in that quiet, sacred moment, Michael knew that his father's final wish had not been a burden, it had been a blessing.